Capsule 3, Peer Assessment of Oral Communication. Evaluating students' oral skills does not have to be the sole responsibility of the teacher. All students in the group can contribute to the evaluation of their peers. In addition to learning by observing their colleagues and having to justify their observations to them, this allows all students to be actively engaged. What is peer assessment? Peer assessment is a means of evaluation that makes students actively take part in the evaluation process and empowers them to take charge of their own oral communication skills by identifying their peers' strengths and weaknesses. For peer assessment to be possible and effective, students must have had prior instruction in oral communication skills through formative workshops. For instance, if students are to evaluate the argumentative processes used by their peers, they must have had previous instruction in these processes to be able to adequately evaluate them. Otherwise, the comments will be unsatisfactory or incomplete. In addition, students must have received training in how to properly assess their peers. They must be taught 4 elements: objective observation, sandwich feedback, naming the oral communication component, and avoiding generalizations. Objective observation. This involves students retaining only what can be named and what does not result from an impression or opinion. The student must always be able to justify what he or she says based on observable or audible facts. The observation must therefore be descriptive and precise. Sandwich feedback. This involves first identifying a positive element of a student's oral communication, then an element for improvement or a constructive comment, and finally another positive element. This last element can be replaced by a recommendation for a future presentation, which will help the observed student to progress. Naming the oral communication component. To avoid a perceived feeling of judgment, it is preferable to name the oral communication component in question rather than use the pronoun you. The use of this pronoun could put some students on the defensive, which is not at all the desired outcome. One would therefore say, "The volume of the voice was too loud at the beginning of the presentation," rather than, "You were talking too loud." Avoiding generalizations. To do this, it is imperative to avoid using words like always and never, as these words imply that a behavior or something else is pervasive, when that is rarely the case. Once it has been decided to implement peer assessment in class, what steps must be taken? Step 1. Self-evaluation. First of all, the student must evaluate himself after his speech. He must orally assess the most successful and least successful elements of his speech according to him. Self-evaluation is essential to the peer assessment process. Indeed, in order for the student to be able to accept feedback from his peers and in turn evaluate his peers, he must first be able to evaluate himself. If a student has difficulty doing so, it will be difficult for him to hear and accept what another student may have to say about his speech. Step 2. Peer assessment. Subsequently, students in the group share their observations with the student who spoke by putting into practice the 4 teachings received: objective observation, sandwich feedback, naming the oral component, and avoiding generalizations. Step 3. Teacher assessment. Finally, the teacher makes his own assessment as well as a synthesis of the peer observations. This step is often very short since students' comments are usually accurate and precise due to the instruction they have received beforehand. This means that the teacher often only needs to confirm and summarize student evaluations. Should students be asked to grade their peers? When students are asked to evaluate their peers, it is important that they do not grade them, but rather provide comments on specific observations. For this reason, students will write their comments in observation grids, which will make it possible to write what has been seen and heard, while the teacher will use an evaluation grid that allows them to write observations and also to grade them. To conclude, in order for peer assessment of oral communication to be effective, it is important to remember that instruction and oral communication components must have been completed beforehand so that students are aware of the expectations associated with these components. Training on how to provide peer feedback must also have been completed. If this is not done, the peer assessment may not be satisfactory. Capsule 3, Peer Assessment of Oral Communication, by Dumais, full professor at the Université du Québec at Trois-Rivières